Dark fantasy, roguelike mechanics, and PS1-Inspired visuals. That's what Tyrant's realm promises, but does it deliver? Today I'm gonna check out this retro-styled adventure to share my honest thoughts. Let's talk about the good, the bad, and everything in between, and thanks to the developers for giving me the game for free. When you start Tyrant's Realm, you wake up in a dungeon room. It's a familiar setup, but the visuals immediately stand out. The PS1 inspired graphics are on point, creating an immersive dark fantasy world that feels nostalgic yet fresh. I was intrigued at first. The atmosphere hooked me in, but the longer I played, the more hesitated I got. Let's address the combat, which is of course the main thing about the game. It's simple. So you block like 1 or 2 attacks, follow up with a heavy attack, rinse and repeat. This loop doesn't change much, and while it's serviceable, it gets honestly pretty repetitive. On the first set difficulty, enemies are almost too easy as well. By the time I got to the third and hardest difficulty, it felt more like that was the normal difficulty of other games in this genre. So to me it never really stuck out as challenging. Elite enemies only attack faster, but don't introduce new combos or mechanics, which made progression feel flat. On the bright side, the shield mechanics are satisfying. You know, you get the same payoff from blocking as you would from dodging, so there's less risk involved. Why worry about perfect timing on a roll when you can just block and avoid damage entirely? One of the game's unique systems is its red, yellow, and green gear system. You'll find weapons, shields, and armor in chests or as enemies drop, each tied to one of these colors. Throughout each level, you'll find skull totems to upgrade specific colors, which boost your stats like max health, attack damage, block percentage, and defense with those colors. I genuinely enjoyed this aspect. It did add a layer of strategy to my runs, as the stats depend entirely on the gear that you find. There's no leveling up traditionally, it's all about the loot. Now, let's talk about the replayability. You're tasked with beating the game 3 times on escalating difficulties to unlock the true ending. Unfortunately, the game's static world map and lack of variety between difficulties makes these subsequent playthroughs feel more repetitive. The enemies and bosses don't change much beyond slightly faster attack speeds, and by your second run, you've already seen almost everything the game has to offer. To keep things interesting, you know, the game could have introduced randomized enemies or unique hazards at higher difficulties. Imagine random bats flying out of nowhere or sandworms bursting from the ground to keep you on edge. Without these extra elements, the later runs lack that thrill you'd expect from a roguelike. If there is one thing I do like about the combat, it is the boss fights. They're memorable from like the old Hunter to like Sharkman or Finesse. Their designs are striking, and the phase transitions do add some excitement in the battle. However, like the regular enemies, bosses fall into that same predictable combat loop. Block a few attacks, swing with your heavy attack, rinse and repeat. There's no real fear of threat or death from these moments. Even so, the boss mechanics and designs provide some much needed variety. The visuals are arguably the game's strongest asset. The retro-inspired graphics and dark fantasy world design are fantastic. The level design is great and the atmosphere is immersive. Whether you're exploring a maze filled with traps or battling through sewers, the game's environment feels pretty good. This retro aesthetic is partly why I kept playing even with the combat flaws that became apparent. There's a merchant where you can buy upgrades like extra health flasks, starting gear for future runs, or secret corridors to skip levels. It's a nice touch, but the interface could use some work. For example, scrolling through the merchant's list is tedious since you can't scroll backward to reach the bottom quickly. It's a small annoyance, but worth mentioning. The game has no dialogue and keeps the story extremely simple. It's your standard, you know, the villain is evil, go defeat it. While this works for this style of game, don't expect a deep narrative. One more thing that lacks in the combat is you have this counter where when you parry an attack, you can also instant kill an enemy. However, there's nothing that this does when you fight a boss. You can't use this mechanic against a boss so it's just something else that just feels flat. Tyrant's Realm is a decent game with some standout features like the retro visuals and some similar boss designs that I thought were cool. It's easy to pick up, making it a great option for newcomers to roguelike genres or casual players that are looking for something simple. However, for seasoned players, the lack of depth in combat, repetitive progression, and predictable enemy design might leave you wanting more. I enjoyed it, and it took me about 5 hours to beat the game 3 times. That's my honest take on Tyrant's Realm. What are your thoughts on these visuals and roguelike gameplay? Drop your comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more honest game reviews. Now, if you want to check out a game I highly recommend, click this video to watch why fountains might surprise you, or check out my playlist of all my recent game reviews. As always, keep gaming and stay awesome.